Hello, everyone. This is Greg Scorzo, and you're listening to the Kodo Publishing Podcast number 3. Today, we are once again going to be doing The Art of Thinking with Karen Harradine. For those of you who don't know, Karen is one of the most interesting and provocative journalists and writer of op-ed pieces in the UK. She's primarily known for her work in The Conservative Woman, but has published in other places, including Culture on the Offensive. Today is the second of a two-part series that we've done with Karen, discussing her numerous and interesting views on different aspects of our contemporary political and spiritual culture. Last week, we discussed Karen's views on the politicization of the police and the ethical problems with the COVID-19 lockdown. This week, we're going to discuss Karen's views related to the persecution of Christians and death and grief. And we'll also be talking about related topics such as whether religion requires social events, whether Christians still oppress Jews, whether religion is ethical, whether or not religious belief is a threat to communist states, the ethics of China's CCP, the impact of economic liberalism on China's authoritarianism, whether China's culture is superior to woke culture, economic imperialism, the importance of freedom in leading a meaningful life, the importance of grieving, the importance of love, and whether religious belief leads to narcissism. The whole mask thing, it makes going out to eat indoors. I don't know how people are going to feel comfortable, because if you're indoors eating but you have to social distance and you have pressure to wear a mask before and after you have a bite,
It's absurd.
it makes going out to eat a very unpleasant, weird, awkward thing.
Absolutely. It just takes away. You know what? I mean, one of the things that's made me very angry about this whole response to COVID, the whole hysterical overreaction, is that it's stripped joy and meaning from our lives. We're not just about keeping safe and, staying alive. Why we live, we need to have joy and meaning. Otherwise, it's very hard to find to find the purpose of life. The purpose of life is not just to survive and be safe. The purpose of life is to have joy and meaning. One of the great pleasures of life is to go to a restaurant with friends and have a wonderful meal and sit and chat and eat great food and laugh. And that has been taken away for us for over a year. To go to a restaurant now, you have to sit outside in the freezing cold, some people are terrified if they do sit and somebody walks past and they'll die of COVID straight away. I mean, it's just, our society's broken and wrecked. It makes me very angry.
I know. I went to the depot, which is the place where our office used to be, which it can't be now because of COVID. I went there with my assistant last week to discuss the final preparations of launching my book. And we were sitting outside, and it was really cold. And it started to rain. We were under a tent, but it was so cold, it was like uncomfortable to be there and drink our coffee. And there was a huge indoor area where you could queue to order your food.
Yeah.
But they wouldn't let us go in this area, even though it was freezing cold.
It's ridiculous. Absolutely absurd. There's no scientific reason for it either. There's no evidence to show that people are catching COVID and dying from sitting in a pub or a restaurant. This is based solely on what I call the psychopathic monsters of sage and their dictates to scare people into thinking that if they don't, do whatever sage tells them, they'll die any second. I mean, it's absolutely, they have destroyed businesses and pubs and restaurants, and they've destroyed people's lives. It makes me furious, absolutely furious. There's no scientific reason why people can't sit inside a pub or a restaurant and enjoy it. We did last summer. Did thousands die of COVID then? No, it's just, it makes me very cross.
And last summer, I remember I went to a coffee shop called St. Martin's with one of my best friends. And we sat outside and had lunch. And at that time, it wasn't that big of a deal because it wasn't cold. So it wasn't...
so cold at the moment.
It wasn't a horrible sacrifice to sit outside and have a nice lunch in the sun. But I did notice that indoors, I couldn't imagine why anybody would want to go inside because all the waiters were dressed in like spacesuits.
It's ridiculous. I feel so sorry for them. Absolutely.
And I just thought, why would you want to go indoors with people that are serving you dressed like spacemen?
Yeah, it's very jarring to witness. I mean, I find it very jarring to witness. I mean, this is the thing. If it was as dangerous as the propaganda campaign makes out COVID to be as dangerous as that, I would totally understand. I'd be the first person to say yay for all the measures. But it's not. That's the whole thing. The mortality rate is so low. It's way too low to warrant this total destruction of our society and economy and our way of life. It's very, very wrong. And what fun can it be to go into a restaurant, be served by a waiter? You can't, someone like me, my hearing's not great, and you can't hear what they're mumbling, and then you have to wash I'm very great. I love washing my hands and using antibac, but even I think it's overkill to have to keep doing that every time you go into a shop and every time you go out of a shop. It is ridiculous. I mean, it's just a very unpleasant experience now to do anything that is what used to be a pleasurable thing. Even like I said, going to the beautician is like she's masked and with a plastic shield with rubber gloves. I mean, it's just I feel really sorry for people who have to work like that.
And it makes you wonder. Well, it makes you understand why so many businesses have gone under, because
Yes.
lockdown has made the thing that makes a business successful and a nice experience for people almost impossible in many cases.
Well, unfortunately, the monsters of Sage, they forget what makes us human. They don't think that we are individuals with souls and ideas and needs and wants and desires of our own. They just think we're uniform kind of people that if they're given instruction, we'll all have to obey no matter what. And that they also, I mean, this is the impression I get from them. And there's a very good piece written by a Twitter friend called Sean Walsh. I will send it to you. On Orthodox Conservatives, where he wrote about how Sage and their behavioral scientists view us as people, and they literally view us as cattle. I mean, it's pretty frightening, and that everything that makes being alive worthwhile has been taken from us. It's just, that's why people are depressed. There's a huge mental health crisis going on, because things that give us joy and meaning were not just meant to just have a job, keep safe, and make sure we don't die. What a dismal, negative, horrible way to live, and that is what they've done to us.
I've heard that a lot of religious services can't function now either, except through Zoom sessions.
No, of course not. Yeah, and that kind of comes to one of the pieces that we've got lined up to discuss today. I mean, religion is a very important thing to many people. Unfortunately, here in the West, there's a certain kind of scorn that people have towards religious Christians and religious Jews. It's very odd. I find it very, very odd. But humans need to believe in something, and whether they believe in a religion or an ideology, or person, or political party, they will need to believe in something. And a lot of people believe in religion, and religion is not just about believing in God and believing in a certain way of life. It's about community as well. It's about being part of a community. It's about being in touch with your fellow human beings, and going to your synagogue or going to your church and going to your mosque. It's not just about the worship of God. It's also about connecting with others, connecting with families, having community support, etc. And that is being taken away by the monsters of Sage and the weak Johnson junta and the appalling opposition parties in Parliament who just have cheered on for even more draconian lockdowns. You take away people's religion, it's a form of socialism, it really is, and it's wicked. To take away religion and community, the things that make us human, which is a belief in something greater than ourselves, whether it's your ideology, whether it is a religion, taking away the things that connect us to other human beings and allow us to spend time with other human beings other than the people in our own homes, to take that away from us for literally hardly any reason at all is a wicked, wicked thing to do.
What would you say if you were to, let's say, encounter a statistic that showed that most religious people are very worried about the pandemic and they're happy to do Zoom sessions instead of go to church or synagogue or mosque?
And I would say they've been brainwashed by Sage's propaganda, and I feel very sorry for them. That's what I would say. I feel desperately sorry, because no, as you rightly said, no religion can survive this. You know, a religion, if you are part of a religion, or if you are a clergy in a religion or whatever it is, you need people. People need to come to your church, to your synagogue. They need, they will pay their membership fees as well. How are churches and synagogues, and I'm specifically referring to Judeo-Christian stuff here, because we are in the West is built on Judeo-Christian values, and we are living in a Christian country. So, it can't survive without people actually physically going to a church, going to a synagogue, and paying their membership fees, doing things to help others. How can these places survive? A Zoom call cannot a church service make. And I feel sorry for those who think that it can. They've been brainwashed and terrorized into submission, and they are fooling themselves.
So this is interesting. So it sounds like you think that Zoom is an inferior form of social communication.
Absolutely. I can't bear it. I mean, I'm happy to have it, otherwise you and I can be able to connect. And I mean, I don't, to me, it just feels, not just Zoom, but every other way that we connect. I think it's great if you're in another country. I mean, as I've been, and you connect with friends living somewhere else, it's fabulous. Modern technology to connect us, like via WhatsApp or whatever, Zoom, whatever you use, when you're in different countries or different cities and etc. It's fantastic, but it's no substitute for visiting your friends and family or people of your community or religious community and spending physical times with them. Humans need to feel touched. They need to feel that there is another human being in the room with them. This is why, kind of isolation is a punishment in prison. Because, to have that takes away everything that makes us feel good about being human. And that's why this is a poor second to being with others humans in the same room as us.
This is fascinating because I know a lot of religious people who say that religion is a personal relationship with God. It's about your beliefs and your practices, but whether or not you get together with others to worship is sort of secondary, whereas you seem to be saying it's not secondary, that it's a crucial, important part of being religious.
Don't forget, yes, I mean, I have a master's in anthropology, and a lot of my time, religion is something that has always interested in me, and my honors thesis, which is in South Africa. In South Africa, you do an honors, which is like a bridging degree between your undergraduate degree and a master's degree, so it's a separate degree. And my honors degree, I based my thesis on a group of Seventh-day Adventists that I studied for a year while I wrote my thesis. And then my master's, I've studied relationships between white people in South Africa, because they were very understudied. So I looked at kinship, identity, and religion with them. So I think what I'm trying to say is that my view of religion has been formed not only by what I studied as an undergraduate with anthropology, but what I wrote what I researched, what I saw, what I interviewed, what the field work I did, participant in field work, seeing how religion really affects people. It's way more than the individual. It's very much about community as well. And I suppose if you kind of divide it in two, yes, there is that individual connection with God, that people have, and you don't have to go to a religious building to experience that. But religion is a lot more broader than that in terms of what it offers a human being.
Okay. So would you say, for instance, that someone who doesn't go to church but who is a devout Christian, that there's something missing from their religious belief?
I would say, to be honest, like for myself, because of my energy levels, I don't often go to a synagogue. But when I go, I really like it, because I feel like, it's really good to connect with fellow Jews. It's really good to kind of say hi to the rabbi. It's really good to have the kiddush afterwards and chat about what you did last week, and I think it's, everyone is individual. I'm not going to say for some people going to a synagogue or church, no matter how religious they are, doesn't work for them. And there are reasons for that, and that's fine. But I would say that even for the secular, like there are many secular Jews who will never go to synagogue, and it's Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and then they're in droves. There's a certain draw that these buildings have, and they're symbolic of many things, including community.
So would you say that in a parallel way, it's also very important for movie theaters to be open?
Absolutely, all these places where you connect and buzz with other humans that you don't even know, and absolutely, we're not meant to be on our own. We're sociable herd animals. And I mean, I've just said that. Say she says herd animals. What I'm saying is, herd animals are sociable. Us humans are exactly the same. We are sociable beings. We need to be in contact with others. And as I said to the last time, I know the bad detrimental effect that I've had with having to kind of do my own self-imposed lockdown with Emmy, where I've been too sick to go out, sometimes, for weeks, a week sometimes. It's very detrimental to me. It's because you're not meant to live like that. You're not meant to live in isolation. And so if you're single and you're living somewhere and you know hardly anybody in the town, you can go to your local movie theater or you go to the local coffee shop and you feel so much better because you're sitting there and there are other people walking around. We're meant to have contact with other humans, and we're meant to physically see them and be in their presence.
Mm-hmm. So do you think it's important for human beings to have contact with humans they don't actually wind up talking to? Like people that are just occupying the same physical space?
Yes, just to be around other humans. It's so important. It's part of what makes us human.
And what kind of a world do you think we would be evolving into socially if we gave that up?
I think a very unempathetic world, a world where we're very narcissistic and navel-gazing, where we're very unaware of what goes on in other people's lives. How do you know what's going on in the world if you're just enclosed in your home all day? It's very difficult to know that. I think we'll go into a world that is very the confines are very narrow, the perspective is very narrow, the empathy for others is almost gone, and everything becomes about you because there's nobody else about. I think a very dark world, a very cold world.
Do you think the world is already moving in that direction without lockdown?
Yes, 100%. For many reasons, and I don't like it.
And do you think this is a particular phenomenon of the West? Do you think the world generally is moving in this direction?
It depends on what's happened with lockdowns, and I think very much in the West, yes, and it depends on the other countries as well. I mean, for example, Sweden didn't have this fanatical, destructive lockdown, so they won't be moving to that. Other countries have had quick lockdowns and then opened up quickly. So I think it will affect most of us in the West, yes, maybe more, I think.
So do you think...
I was going to say very much in the West, we do have a tendency to be very individualistic and navel-gazing. So I think that aggravates that, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. So it seems like, in a way, you think lockdown is kind of accelerating tendencies that were already existing quite strongly in 2019.
Yeah, I think so. And then this is the thing, like technology, as I said the last time, like green technology is fantastic. I love technology. But it's got to work for the majority. It's got to be for the benefit of society. What is happening right now, this isolation, is so detrimental to society. Yes, it's great we can all connect on Zoom. Yes, it's great that, we can phone each other on WhatsApp and blah, blah, etc., etc. But where the hell are the human contact? Where are our dinner parties and our sitting in coffee shops, watching strangers walk by and just getting out there and seeing what life is about? Where are the communal park runs that, like, I know William used to love taking part in, where a bunch of strangers go run together? Where's our, sense of community and cohesiveness and a sense of humanity? It's being taken away from us, and it's desperately sad, and it's getting worse.
Do you think religion in general can act as a corrective to this tendency that you think is being exploited by lockdown?
Yes, I think so. Because if you look at religion, it's not just about the individual, it's about community. And it's also about one thing that religion does. You're believing in something bigger than yourself. So when you're aware of something more than just your everyday life, you're aware of others, you're aware of the world, you're aware of other aspects and dimension of life that has really got nothing to do with you, but you have that awareness. And I think that's very important for a world to be to live in a good, empathetic, humanistic, kind world, which at the moment we don't at all. And we're living in the worst kind of world right now.
So speaking of religion and its place in the modern world, I want to talk to you a bit about an article that you wrote called China's Open Season on Christians with the Blessing of the West that was published in The Conservative Women on April 26, 2021. And
Yes.
before I ask you about this, I just thought maybe you might, for our listeners, explain to us what motivated you to write this piece.
I have been writing on persecuted Christians for a number of years now. I think the first time I started writing was the same year I started writing for Conservative Women in 2016. Christians are the most persecuted people in the world. And this is what I come back to, Greg, where I said to you, the problem with the left dominating the narrative in the mainstream media, et cetera, is that there's this whole navel gazing and identity issue, identity politics and woke ideology and oppression Olympics means that the real victims of suffering are ignored. And the real victims of suffering in this world today are persecuted Christians. They are the most persecuted people in the world. What is happening to them is absolutely horrific. And you never read about it in the mainstream media. It's very rare to see an article about that. And I don't know why I became aware of it. I just became aware of it. And I've been writing pieces on persecuted Christians for conservative women since 2016. And the persecution is getting worse. I mean, yes, you have the case of Asia Bibi in Pakistan, and that made global headlines. But millions of Christians are suffering every single day in places like in Africa, in the Middle East, in Asia. They are persecuted horrifically. And, like the BBC would rather run something that how dare an announcer say, ladies and gentlemen, on a train running to London, rather than the fact that Christians are hauled up into concentration camps in North Korea just for the fact that they are Christians. It's just, sometimes I look at this world and I think it's completely bonkers. It's completely nuts. The priority of what, particularly in the West, and what is discussed in the mainstream media and our discourse, completely ignores the real horrors of this world. And I think I know why, particularly when it comes to Christian. It's not trendy. As I've written before, Christians are not seen as a trendy sort of thing in the West. And also seen as Christians are sort of in the West are seen as these kind of, middle-class white people who, are not deserving of any sympathy. But the majority of Christians in the rest of the world are ethnic minorities, and they are not white. And they are being persecuted people just don't realize what is actually going every single day. And it saddens me. And now China's in the mix. I don't know, with China as well, we'll come to that and why so little is being said. And yeah.
So one of the things that you write in this piece is one of the more interesting passages is, quote, "Like everything else in our racism-obsessed society, Christianity is viewed through the prism of identity politics. The left's dominance over the discourse on oppression means that Christians are categorized as rich white people, therefore maligned by our cultural and political elite and deemed unworthy of help. Yet most Christians are not white, and many live in dire poverty, risking persecution, torture, or death to practice their faith. Thanks to the rise of authoritarian regimes such as China and the demise of the once free and strong West, their plight is deteriorating, unquote. Now, one of the interesting things about that passage is it, first of all, is written by a Jewish woman.
Yes.
And a lot of people would say, why are you writing about the persecution of Christians when actually it's Jews who are persecuted by Christians and have been historically? How would you respond to that?
So a couple of things. First of all, there are very few Christians now who persecute Jews, number one. And yes, historically that has happened, but it's not happening now. And I can't let the fact that what happened to my people 500 years ago, or whenever it was, the Spanish Inquisition, etc., stop me from speaking out about the Christians today who never harmed a Jew. Why must I be quiet about them because of what their ancestors did 500 years ago or 200 years ago? It would be quite revengeful of me to do that, to purposely keep quiet because of that. And yes, Jews are not being really persecuted by Christians anymore. It's more by socialists, it's more by Islamists, it's more by woke ideologists and the whole, anti-Israel crowd who are very far beyond belonging to Christians, who are not practicing Christians. Many of them are not practicing Christians. Yes, you do get parts of the element of the church who are very anti-Israel and anti-Semitic, but it's not the fault of some poor Christian in North Korea or in Pakistan that church leaders in the West have climbed onto the anti-Israel bandwagon. It's not their fault. Their suffering shouldn't continue just because the church leaders in the West can't think for themselves and love to do their own anti-Semitic bit by bashing Israel. In all good conscience, I won't let the church leaders here in the West dictate what I should write about when it comes to the suffering of those in our world. And the suffering of persecuted Christians is heinous.
So what would you say to the objection that Christianity is the religion of most civilized Western white privileged people insofar as they are religious? And because of that, we should be focusing, at least in the West, on helping religions that are more marginalized in our communities, that are not predominantly practiced by white people, like Islam or Hinduism and religions like that. What would you say in response to that?
I would say it's a degree of perspective. Are people in the West, people are allowed to practice whatever religion they want. You're not thrown into a concentration camp just because you are practicing your religion. For example, like one of the pieces that I wrote a long time ago on persecuted Christian, I started out saying that, me, a Jew, married my husband who was of the Methodist faith. Other than a few kind of, like from more religious people on my side saying, oh, it's not so good to marry out, blah, blah. I wasn't persecuted for marrying somebody not of my faith. He wasn't persecuted for marrying a Jew. None of us were thrown into prison for that. It's a degree of how bad is the suffering. And to be quite frank, religions in the West are not marginalized legally, whereas in countries like Libya and Iraq and Iran and China and North Korea, the list goes on. It's just unbelievable. In Somalia, if you are Christian, if you are of that minority faith in those countries, your life is hell. You are faced with persecution. You are faced with torture. You are faced with being murdered for your faith. That does not happen in the West. Yes, you have a few Meshuggahs, i.e. that's Yiddish for crazy people who have unfortunately shot others and killed others for their religion. But it's not state-sanctioned persecution other than others as it is in those countries. And that's the difference.
What would you say to somebody who says that you should be responsible for what your society is doing, not what North Korea or Iran is doing? And in our society, we are persecuting BAME people and the religions that are not in the majority.
But we're not. It's how you define persecution. And we come back to this whole thing about racism. What is real racism? And we have equality under the law in the West. If you went out and you tried to kill somebody because of their faith, you would be thrown into prison straight away. If you kind of decided, if you went out and was really nasty and abusive to somebody because of their faith, chances are the police would come to you knocking at your door. There is a very big difference between what goes on in the West and what goes on in these other countries. And what kind of a society would we be where we focus on our navel-gazing issues here in the West, where we have we used to have so much freedom and so much security, and things are enshrined in law to protect people's lives, to protect their faith, to protect the fact that they are whatever religion they are. And instead we're focusing on things that have been exaggerated and ignoring the real suffering of other human beings. I don't want to live in a society that just, says, somebody said, a mean word to me because I'm this. So let's ignore the rest of the suffering in the rest of the world because they're not in the West. I don't want to live in that. I think we do have in the West a huge issue, and I've written about it many times, with anti-Semitism. It's very dangerous, and as a Jew, I'm always very aware of it. But I would say that we can hold two things in our minds at the same time. We can hold in the fact that, yes, there is racism in the West that needs to be solved. And we can hold in our mind, and we can hold in the public consciousness this terrible, terrible persecution of Christians all over the world. And to me, that is the more important thing.
Okay, so when you say persecution in the context of this piece, how are you defining the persecution of Christians? What exactly does that mean?
So there are various ways that they've been persecuted. As I mentioned, North Korea, if they're caught with a Bible, or if their neighbor suspects they've seen one of their neighbors praying, because you can't pray in North Korea, they are deemed Christians and thrown into concentration camps in places like Somalia, etc. In a lot of these countries in North Africa and Libya, etc. If you are found to be Christian, in the Sudan, South Sudan, they are like sought out by Islamists and murdered for their faith. Murdered if you're a Christian, as well as having a second-class citizenship. So, like with Asia Bibi, she was accused of blasphemy by her Muslim co-worker. There was no proof, etc. The fact that she is a Christian in that country, so she's a second-class citizen. So the word of the Muslim co-worker would be believed before the word of Asia Bibi because she's a Christian. So a lot of Christians face being a second-class citizen in countries like that. So even if they are not killed outright or sent to concentration camps or thrown into prison, in Iran, Christians are thrown into prison straight away for their faith. I think it's illegal in Iran to be Christian. So if you found out to be Christian, you are thrown into prison straight away as a Christian. There's a lot of information on persecuted Christians that I get from an organization called Open Doors. And they have their worldwide watch list that they keep going of the top 50 countries in the world that persecute Christians. And if you click on whichever country, I think China is at the top at the moment. No, not China. I think North Korea is at the top at the moment. And if you click on each country and read how the Christians are persecuted on the top 50 countries that persecute Christians in the world, it will make your blood curdle what happens to these people. And I've been reading Open Doors for a long time, and I've been writing on persecuted Christians for a long time, and I'm still horrified that in the 21st century, there are people living in countries where they are persecuted for their faith. And as a Jew, particularly having had my people persecuted for their religion by the Nazis, I cannot be quiet. I cannot abide it.
So how are Christians treated in Israel, just out of curiosity?
Very well, because in Israel, you have equality under the law, regardless of what religion, sex, Tel Aviv is the gay capital of the world, basically. I mean, there's a lot of, don't believe the propaganda in the mainstream media and the anti-Israel rubbish. Christians, it's a very interesting, not only are Christians safe in Israel, a lot of Christians flee from the West Bank and from Gaza, the PA-controlled West Bank and from Gaza into Israel, because there's a lot of persecution of Christians in the Palestinian territories. Check Open Doors if you don't believe me. And so Israel is a sanctuary for Christians. And it's also very interesting. Israel is where the Baha'i religion, yes, they're not Christians, but they are another religion persecuted in Iran. And they have their headquarters in Haifa. And their beautiful temple, the Baha'i temple, is beautiful. And it's right to the top of Haifa. You can just see, you go to the temple, you can just see for miles outside, across the sea. It's beautiful. And that's the thing. So there's equality under the law for faith. Christians are not persecuted. And many religious Christians flock to Israel because they're not persecuted there.
So it sounds like on your analysis, the primary drivers of Christian persecution are either communists or Muslims. Is that correct, would you say?
I would say Muslims, because I think that would be very unfair to many Muslims who do a lot of interfaith work and don't, particularly Muslims in this country, and there are plenty of Muslim countries that don't persecute Christians. I would say, certain Islamist regimes, particularly the ones in Africa, like Somalia, in rogue states like that, in Sudan, like really fundamentalistic Islamic regimes that do this kind of persecution, like Iran. So I wouldn't say, there's a lot of, it depends which country you're talking about. So I would say it would be fundamentalist Islamic regimes, like you have in Pakistan, that do the persecution. Mm-hmm. I would never just give it a broad thing of saying Muslim states, because there are many that don't.
So what would you say to, let's say, a woke secular person in the West who says Christianity is a force that promotes irrationality, it promotes the belief that someone rose from the dead, it's anti-science, it's responsible for a lot of people rejecting the belief that dinosaurs existed. It promotes a cosmology which science shows is demonstrably false in many respects. It promotes homophobia and transphobia. So if this ideology, which is dangerous and irrational, is persecuted in other parts of the world, that's a good thing. What would you say to that woke person?
I would say, first of all, to persecute somebody because of their ideology is a horrific thing to do, because of their religion is a horrific thing to do. All religions will have a negative and positive thing to them. There's no religion that doesn't have that. You could say very similar to about Islam, it has the same kind of ideas about homosexuality, etc. And we're also not talking about fundamentalists. I'm talking, you're not talking about fundamentalist Christians only. A lot of these people that in the developing worlds who are being persecuted as Christians, or in the countries that I mentioned, like China, etc., are not necessarily like your fundamentalist Christians that you find in like the US or something like that, who go, if you're homosexual, you must be burned at the stake. They're just Christians who believe in God, and they believe in Jesus, and they pray to Jesus, and they're part of their belief system. They're not interested in, hounding somebody because they are gay or because they are trans or whatever. They just want to have the most basic form of Christianity and believe in that and to worship as the way they want to. I think it's very narcissistic of somebody to go, and it's very typical of the West to be very narcissistic and go, oh, well, that's what Christians are, these fundamentalist Bible bashers who want to ban, homosexuality. Yes, you have that. But that is a very small part of what Christianity is and what Christians are in this world today. The same thing with Islam. You have a broad spectrum. You have your fundamentalist Islamists who want to kill everyone who's not Muslim. And then you have your everyday Muslim who goes to the mosque and is very British and waves the British flag and loves the Queen. You can't, say that, with the same thing in my religion. Like, you have very religious people who are very out of touch with the everyday world and very frum, which is the word we use for religious Jews. And then you have secular Jews who do nothing but go to synagogue on Yom Kippur. You can't just see it through one perspective. It's not, and if somebody who's a believer in woke ideology, they're only seeing things in one perspective, one prism. And to me, that's quite a very destructive and selfish way of looking at it.
So suppose you get another objection, let's say, from a Jewish person. And the Jewish person says, well, look, most Christians believe that you must believe Jesus Christ is your Lord and Savior. If you don't, you're going to go to hell, independently of how good of a person you are. And hell is presumably an infinity times worse than Auschwitz. So they believe that my people deserve a fate worse than Auschwitz. So this Christian religion is evil. And because it's evil, it deserves no sympathy if it's being persecuted. You should be writing about the persecution of Jews. How would you respond to that Jewish person?
I have written 70% of what I've written has been about anti-Semitism. So that is what I would point out, number one. I've written over and over and over again on anti-Semitism. The second thing I would say is that, again, you come to just viewing a religion through just one prism, one perspective, and just seeing it as like your Bible bashers, white privileged people, or the way they're described, living somewhere in America like that. That is just one small aspect. And as a Jew, I've only experienced one fundamentalist Christian telling me that he wishes I'd convert because he loves me and he doesn't want me to go to hell. And I just thought that was really sad that somebody could actually really think that would happen to me. But that still would not stop me from speaking out about these persecuted Christians. To be quite frank, I cannot, the majority of these persecuted Christians have far more worries than thinking about, saving a Jewish soul, as they would say it, or, outlawing homosexuality. Those are things that are almost a luxury for them to think about. The more kind of, they're just thinking about survival.
Okay, what would you say if it was put to you this way, right? Hitler believed that Jews deserve Auschwitz.
Mm-hmm.
Christians believe Jews deserve hell, which is presumably much, much worse than Auschwitz.
I would say that all religions have a reformation. All religions have different spectrums to it, and there would be some Christians who would believe that. And I would think that's pretty abhorrent. But again, there's some Muslims, Islamic fundamentalists, who believe that if you're not Muslim, you deserve to be killed. So, it comes back to the same thing. Are you only going to take the fundamentalists and base your perception of a person's religion on what fundamentalists say? A Christian saying Jews must burn in hell, and an Islamist saying all non-Muslims must die? Or do you see that as a small minority and look at the majority of those who don't think like that? And particularly Christianity's had its reformation. They're very, I haven't, other than that one man that I knew at university 30 years ago telling me that, I've never had a Christian person, and I know many religious Christians, ever telling me that at all. In fact, many of the fellow religious Christians that I know are huge Israel supporters and supporters of us Jews. I've never had any of them say that to me. So I would say it's a tiny minority, and I would say that if people let that color the view of how they see a particular religion, it's as bad as those who think all Muslims want to kill you because you're not a Muslim. No, they don't. It's a small majority of Islamic fundamentalists that do. We have to separate the fundamentalists, and as well as looking at the actual tenets of the religion, like what does the religion believe now? And that's quite difficult to actually establish, because you've got so many different sects and so many different ways and approaches to the religion. There's not even Judaism, you've got that. Many different kind of ways to approach the religion. This is what people in yeshivas argue about for, they spend hours each day in a yeshiva arguing about the interpretation of this law and that law. You can't just say this religion believes in this, because there'll be always different interpretations for it.
So what would you say to somebody who says, you're right that the belief that Jews are evil might be a minority belief within Christianity, but that's because Christianity is dying out, and when religions die out, they become more liberal. So actually, the Christianity dying out in the world phenomenon is the reason why most Christians don't believe you deserve hell. If Christianity suddenly became popular again, then that belief would become much more predominant, and then they would persecute you again. What would you say to that?
I would say that in the last few hundred years, other than the Shoah, Jews were not persecuted because Christians thought that we would go to hell. That wasn't the reason for the persecution. As I said, Christianity has had its reformation. That it would be very unlikely, even if that did happen, I cannot see it lasting, because that is not the reasons why Jews are being persecuted by Christians, that they deserve to go to hell. That is not the reasons for historical Christian persecution of Jews. If that happened, I think it would be quite a I think it wouldn't last. I think it would be something that would be overridden by other reasons as to why Christians would persecute Jews. I think as well that it's about what is happening right now in this world. And right now, Christian persecution of Jews, real persecution of Jews, is not happening in the West. Yes, you have high levels of anti-Semitism. There's a big difference between saying anti-Semitism and persecution. If anti-Semitism is not stopped, if it's not confronted, then it leads to persecution. For Christians, it's way too late for many of them. The anti-Christian stuff that goes on in the countries that I've mentioned and many other places has never been confronted. And so as a result of that, it's led to persecution. And it continues to do so.
So one of the things that you've described quite eloquently in your piece is anti-Christian culture that you see in Chinese society.
Yes.
So one passage goes, quote, "Recreational parks popular with Chinese citizens are being used by the regime for propaganda installations which warn against practicing religions deemed harmful to the state, and they encourage citizens to report any proselytizing they see. Families are told to inform on each other should they suspect adherence to any of the disapproved faiths, including Christianity," unquote. The first thing I thought when I read that is, do you think that there's an element of persecution of Christians because Christian ideology is by implication anti the Chinese government in a way where other religions wouldn't be so much?
No, not at all. Because you see the persecution of Uyghur Muslims in China and of Jews as well. It's not about what the religion does or what people who of the religion believe, whether they're anti-government or not. It's about the fact that the CCP has one idea, one identity of what China should be, and religion takes away from that. And so that is one of the reasons that minority religions in China, like Christians, Jews, and Muslims, are persecuted there. The CCP has this is what the Chinese identity should be is, and religion is harmful to the state. So it's not about being anti-government. It's about being what they view as harmful. It's taking away the focus and actually worship of the state to God and to a sense of community that doesn't apply just to your identity as a member of the Chinese country, but also to a religion as well. They see it as I've written there, as harmful and taking away from what they see as a cohesive identity of China, and that religions take away from that. And also, because of that, it's seen as a threat to the hegemony of the CCP, that anything that takes away the way that they have presented Chinese identity and making sure that people adhere to Chinese identity, if you do anything that diverts from that, you threaten their power base. And that is also one of the reasons. Religion itself, all religions, it's not just Christians there.
Do you think that worry is, from their perspective, justified? So if we saw a huge uprising in members of religious communities in China, would that, you think, threaten the government in some way?
But there hasn't been, I mean, look what they've done to the Uyghur Muslims. I mean, yes, there have been a few fundamentalists from that. But again, the majority of those Muslims are just everyday people like you and me. I've written on the Uyghur Muslims many times before. For their faith, they are thrown into concentration camps in China. And it's not about them. There's no uprising in China. People are cowed there. They're under digital slavery. So none of these religious groups are uprising against the government there, against the regime. I mean, if you look at Christians throughout the world, none of them are responsible for uprising against the countries that they live in. They're not, basically, these Christians, and they are often living very fragmented lives and very uncohesive lives and very disconnected from each other, because they have to be so underground with their faith, are so disconnected that they'd never be able to organize some kind of revolution against the state. They're probably, as I said, it's a matter of survival for them right now. So all these kind of more lofty ideas of, bringing the downfall of the state and persecuting other religions so that they can get their power base, blah, blah, et cetera, will probably never cross their minds because they are just wanting to survive and they're just wanting to practice their faith in a place that nobody will actually shock them to the police and send them off to prison. So no, there's no excuse.
Do you think that at least the major monotheistic religions, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, do you think that they are compatible with communism, or do you think they clash with communism fundamentally?
I put it the other way around. Communism clashes with them. Because all three faiths have at their center a belief in a higher power. And communism is total and utter worship of the state. And it's a jealous ideology that does not want any other competition. So it's not that these three Abrahamic religions have a problem with communism, it's that communism has a problem with them.
What would you say if somebody said, that's true of extreme communists, just like it's true of extremist Christians, that they don't want any competition from other ideology either, and they would say things like, our God is a jealous God, but most communists and most Christians are moderate. What would you say to that?
I'd say, look at the history of my people living in communist countries. Jews never fared well under any socialist regime. Just open a history book, it will tell you my own family fled the 1917 revolution from they were ghettos in the Pale of Settlement. They fled the Russian Revolution. Those that remained behind were persecuted horrifically. And Jews were persecuted horrifically in the USSR, thrown into gulags for being Jewish. I mean, they're, not allowed to practice their faith. It's not like, in socialist countries, we had a great time. We're being persecuted terribly. And look at the current socialist, communist countries, whatever you want to call it, China, North Korea, Marxist countries. Christians and Jews, I mean, thank God no Jews in North Korea, but they're Jews in China, are persecuted horrifically. So you can say that, your everyday, communist in the West who's flying the flag for, communism, but has no problem with his Jewish neighbor living next door. Yeah, that's fine, no problem. But it depends where you live. If that person was living in North Korea or that person was living in China, they would be having a huge problem with somebody they suspected as Christian. As you can see, as what I've written, the CCP encourages their citizens to report anyone they suspect of being Christian, of being, of proselytizing or doing anything that can be seen as harmful. So, yeah, that is what my answer would be.
So one of the things you've written is, quote, the more economic power China wields, the less resources the rest of the world has to fight its dominance. Islamic nations indebted to the CCP via the Belt and Road Initiative don't protest about the persecution of the Uyghur Muslims because they have no wish to bite the hand which feeds them. African and European countries are reluctant to protest against China's persecution of Christians for the same reason, unquote. Can you tell our listeners a bit about the Belt and Road Initiative? What is that?
Yes, it's basically it's a project that the CCP launched a few years ago. I think it was 2013, but don't quote me on that. I'd need to double check. And basically what they do is they invest in infrastructure and ports and mines and give loans to other countries, etc. Because China's been made very wealthy by the movement of Western industries to China, where Western industries have taken advantage of the cheap labor, and then basically things are sold back to us in the West. So we're buying everything from China. China is a very wealthy country. And so they are set to be the world's superpower now, particularly since their lockdown propaganda works so well and Western economies have crashed. So the Belt and Road Initiative is what I call economic colonialism. And China literally has bought many countries in the Middle East and Africa. In Zimbabwe, for example, there are many Chinese-owned mines that have destroyed the environment. They have destroyed communities. They have done horrific things. They are colonialists. This is rampant colonialism. I wrote a piece last year about China's colonialism into the South China Sea. They've built military bases there. We've seen them threaten Hong Kong. We see them now threatening Taiwan. And many of the countries, like, for example, Iran, I wrote about this recently as well, and China signed a 25-year pact where China is investing billions into Iran, i.e., buying things up, and Iran is selling oil cheaply to China, which enriches China anymore. So why would a country like Iran, that has obviously been bitten by the sanctions that Trump rightly imposed on them, and now are in bed with China, why would they complain to China, who's giving them billions and billions, about their fellow Muslims and being held in concentration camps? The same thing for many countries in the Middle East and Africa, where China has literally bought them through the Belt and Road Initiative. It's investing in infrastructure. It's giving loans to governments. It's investing in ports, etc., etc. So, and as I said, like in places like South Africa and Zimbabwe mines, they're the most fervent, brutal colonialists. I've written about this several times. All the pieces I've written about this are on the Conservative Women website. They're colonialist endeavors in Africa. They are brutal taskmasters, brutal. And yeah, they're colonialists. And the Belt and Road Initiative is a massive investment. In a way, a part of me almost admires the CCP because everything they've done is for China's interest. They do nothing that doesn't suit China. They do everything for China's interest. Many Western countries don't, in terms of their own people.
This is where I suppose your writing gets very fascinating to me, because it sounds here your anti-colonialism critique is a bit ironically left-wing. Not just in the sense that many left-wing people agree with you about this, but also in the sense that a conservative rejoinder might be, look, colonialism is the first stage of liberalization. So if China is doing its colonialism now and making money and trading with the world, that means in the future it's going to be more liberal and less likely to persecute Christians, and its communism, if it still exists, will be much more moderate than what it is now. How could you have a problem with this?
And I would say, look at the last 5 years. Has China become more liberal, or have they become more authoritarian? And the answer is the latter. The more powerful they get, the more authoritarian they get. And what they have exported, it's not like Britain's colonial endeavors. Yes, there were nasty things that happened, but they exported the language, they exported a parliamentary system, a transport system, all these things, sport. China has not exported anything good. They have exported authoritarianism. They've exported lockdowns. They've exported and exploited other countries. China is not a force for good in this world. And the more colonial they get, the more power they get, which they've been getting over the last few years particularly, and they're getting more and more now, the worse they behave and the worse they become. So I would say just look at the reality of what they are. Look what they've done to the Uyghur Muslims. I mean, it's abhorrent. We're sitting right now in the 21st century and 1 million Muslims are in concentration camps because they're Muslim. And the rest of the world stays silent. I mean, it's just... and as their power base grows, which it is, they become worse and worse and worse. And that is what I'd say.
What would you say to the conservative argument that you see occasionally popping up in various magazines that if you look at China long term, if you look at, say, their laws and social norms in the 70s, they were much worse than they are now. So the liberalization is actually, even though it's taking a bit of a longer time, it is creating a more tolerant, open, free society even there. Because that's what capitalism does.
I'd say economically, yes, it's different now for China. They're a capitalist society. But socially, they're just as bad as they ever used to be. I would say, economically, yes, more liberal, but has it done us any good? Has it done the world any good? China's liberal economic experience, has it been a force for good in this world? No, it's been a horrific force. It's been a horrific thing. Brutal colonialism of Africa, persecution of minorities in their own country, and nobody says anything because China owns most of the world. I was just going to say, and that is where the economic liberalism has brought us.
Okay, so what would you say to a different conservative who says, you're being kind of unfair on China because although China does have problems with individual rights that the West doesn't, it has a society that in many ways is superior to the West because it's not navel-gazing, it's not woke, it's not obsessed with equality of outcome, it's not obsessed with human rights. There's more of a sense of agency in China than there is for your average Westerner. China in many ways is closer to the value system that you wish the West had. What would you say to that?
I would say, no, thank you. I take woke ideology over authoritarianism any time. And unfortunately, the West is heading into authoritarianism. I mean, China's digital slavery. It's a digital slavery society. You lose credits, and if you do something wrong that the state says that's wrong, you said the wrong word, or you're against the state, you lose certain credits, social credits. You can't access certain things like a mortgage or going to the doctor, etc. That is not that's horrific to me. I'd rather have some woke ideologists, bother me than live and have them have the freedom to do that, than live in a society where the internet is not free, where social media is not free, where everything is governed by the state. And if you try and object in any way, there's no freedom of expression, there's no freedom of religion, there's no freedom of different political parties in terms of different political beliefs. There's no freedom, full stop. What kind of society is that? That's a society that is in deep cognitive dissonance. It's society that is unfree with no meaning or joy. And, it's horrific.
So what would you say to a Chinese person who says, the reason we don't have these freedoms that you do is because we're happier and we're more content with life and we don't need to have that exacerbated sense of entitlement that Westerners do. We can be happy even with all these regulations and you can't. And so in a way, we're a healthier, more psychologically mature society. What would you say to that Chinese person?
I'd say two things. One, well, that's great, but what happens if the CCP does something that actually harms you and your family? Will you still be thinking the same thing? It's great if you're a fan of the CCP and the CCP likes you and you're part of the in crowd, so to speak. Great, have a great time. But if you put one foot wrong, your perspective will change completely. And I would say, let's have a look at what's been going on in the West the last year and a bit. Have people enjoyed this authoritarian swing by the Johnson junta? Has it been great fun having everything restricted for whatever reason? And if you really like that, then have a word with yourself. Then you do not belong in what was once the free West. Freedom is the most essential part of being human. We need freedom to love who we want to love. We need freedom to worship who we want to worship, to be what religion we want to be. We need freedom to say what we want to say, to express ourselves, to be who we are, because freedom brings us meaning and joy and gives us a life. I grew up in a country that was so unfree on so many levels, not just because of apartheid, but because of everything in that apartheid brought. Even for somebody that was deemed honorary white, as Jews were in apartheid South Africa, the lack of freedom there, even for somebody like, us Jews, was horrific. Nothing, of course, compared to what my fellow Black South Africans suffered from. But what I'm saying is, I know what it's like to grow up in society with no freedom, where everything is dictated by the state, where you put one foot wrong and your neighbor will report you to the police and off to prison you go. People in the West have no idea what it's like to live in a country where you do not have freedom, where where your minutiae of your everyday life is dictated to by the state. And let's have a look at the politicians in Parliament. Are these the kind of people you want around as a dinner party? No, thank you. Most of them are venal, corrupt monsters. There are a few that are wonderful, but the majority are just horrific human beings. And we have to listen to what they say and live our lives exactly to the demented rules they come up with. Yes, and that is exactly what I would say to somebody who's saying, oh, look how great it is to live in China. Yes, if you're on the same side as the CCP and you have no problem and you're never in trouble, fantastic. What happens if you decide to be Christian? What happens if you feel something is unfair, a new rule that the CCP comes out with and you don't like it, and you maybe say something to a neighbor, the neighbor shops you to the police and off you go to the concentration camps. I mean, it's just any Westerner who wants to sacrifice their freedom that we've had in the West for something like, what they perceive as a happy existence in places like China, seriously needs to take a long, hard, good look in the mirror.
Okay, one of the things you write is, quote, having sold lockdown propaganda to the gullible West, crashing economies and destroying societies, China is poised to become the world's economic superpower. Newly impoverished Western nations, increasingly reliant on trade and aid from China, will be reluctant to admonish the CCP on its persecution of minority faith groups, unquote. Now, what's fascinating about that is, again, another conservative argument comes to mind, which is countries should look after their own. And all we should be worried about in terms of the world is making sure that we can extend prosperity as much as possible. That produces more liberal outcomes. But outside of that, don't worry about how countries treat populations, because that's a pathway towards war, which is the most unethical thing you can have as a way of doing any kind of social change. What would you say to that conservative argument?
I'd say, look what happened with the Shoah. The world turned a blind eye to the persecution of Jews in Nazi Germany, and 6 million of my people died. And as a Jew, I cannot let that kind of perspective excuse ever pass in my eyes, because the moment we turn our eyes away from the persecution of others, for whatever reason it is, but particularly because of their faith, because of their religion, is the moment we turn ourselves into unhuman drones. And I just find that abhorrent. That's what I would say. Look at what happened with the Shoah.
Would you say that anytime it becomes apparent that any society is persecuting a group, all of the other countries should join against them, even if that risks global instability?
I think we have global instability anyway, Greg. And I think there are many wars being fought right now that people don't even have a clue about. Look what's going on in the Ukraine. Look what's going on in Africa with Al-Shabaab and the jihadists there. There are wars being fought many times, and not necessarily, yes, on a global scale, but war is not necessarily always an evil thing. It's sometimes in Judaism, it says, sometimes you have to go to war to defeat evil. And sometimes if way too many people are suffering, you have to risk war. And there is global strife anyway. It's it's the decisions that we make that determine whether something is worth going to war for or not. And think about how many of my fellow Jews would have been saved if the Allied forces had gone to war a lot earlier. War is not necessarily evil.
What would you say to the libertarian argument that throughout most of human history, human societies have been absolutely awful in terms of persecuting subpopulations? Almost every country has persecuted a subpopulation in the past. The only thing that really explains why countries have stopped doing that is economic trade, prosperity, and growth. So that's what we should be concentrating on and encouraging, rather than calling economic colonialism. What would you say to that argument?
I'd say, look at the reality. Have the countries in Africa that China has spread its Belt and Road Initiative, have they suddenly turned into beacons and oasis of peace and prosperity? No, the opposite. Literally, China has raped them, has taken out all the, for example, like the mines, everything like, the stuff in the mines has been exported to China, where they take advantage of the wealth of those countries. No. If China's Belt and Road was creating a lot of prosperity in countries like Africa, I'd say, oh, it's great, absolutely, And if people were being treated wonderfully by these colonialist masters, I'd say, okay, maybe this economic prosperity helps. It's the opposite. It's the other way around. So I'd say look at the reality of it. It's done the exact opposite. Because China's trade isn't about making other countries prosperous. China's Belt and Road Initiative is about giving China diplomatic power and economic power. That's what it's about.
What would you say to the argument that every country does this, China just more successful at this point in time?
I would say, has Britain gone into Zimbabwe, destroyed a community and destroyed the land there? No. I would say, has France suddenly decided to go into threaten Taiwan with warships around the base? No. I mean, I don't think it's comparing apples with oranges. Like most trade is done, particularly from the West, is done peacefully. There's no kind of, and it's done without buying up diplomatic favors. It's done reasonably ethically. Whereas the CCP's Belt and Road Initiative, there's nothing ethical about that at all.
Okay, so do you disagree with the idea that China is just like a Western country would have been about 150 years ago, and the only thing that's keeping them from behaving more decently is just time and liberalization?
I would say that as China has become more economically liberal, like Western countries did, and if they had become a more socially liberal country, I'd say that argument has merit. But it doesn't because of the authoritarian regime that China has become. Well, it's just different now, but it's still authoritarian and it's getting worse. They're stepping up their persecution of minorities. So I would say if they had become more socially liberal, I would say yes, then that argument could hold water, but it doesn't because of what China has turned into. Their economic liberalism has given them a lot of power over the rest of the world and over their own citizens, and not in a good way.
Do you think that there is any pathway towards social liberalism in China at this point in time?
Unfortunately not. I would have said maybe a year ago, before our gullible, stupid Western governments, locked us down because of the propaganda sent to them by the CCP, etc. And I suspect that our government is in ad hoc to the Belt and Road Initiative, as our British universities are very much so. There's evidence with that. That's been written in the mainstream media. So they will never protest the persecution of Christians in China, because China now rules us. I often say China has conquered the West without firing a shot, and mainly because our stupid leaders put us in lockdown, crashed our economies, and is now bringing a very authoritarian way of society, like your vaccine passports, which is a pathway to digital slavery, which is what happens in China. So instead of the West and our values that we once had being exported to China, China's authoritarian digital slavery, the state controls everything that you do, is being exported to the West. And that is terrifying.
Do you think people like this exporting in the West because it sort of it on some levels is psychologically associated with equality and protecting people from the population, being racist and sexist and things like that?
The irony is that China is known to be a very racist society. And we know that they persecute people because of their religion, but they are very, very racist as well. I'm not talking about every single Chinese person before anybody jumps down my throat. I'm talking about the state itself. It's a racist state. So I would say that no.
Interesting. So I suppose we should segue here a bit from China to death.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, it's terrifying. I mean, people I wrote for Conservative Women a while ago that the CCP has actually invested in anarchy groups in America because it suits them for America to burn up in flames. It's on the Conservative Women website. This is not conjecture. I base everything I write on evidence. I link to actual evidence in the mainstream media. And basically, the CCP has invested in American anarchist groups, including those affiliated with Black Lives Matter, because it suits them to have America suddenly, disintegrate and burn itself to the ground and turn into a socialist state. A lot of these groups that the CCP have invested in are socialist groups. And so, this is China's way of making sure that the world does as what China says, because the more the world is less, I suppose what I'm trying to say, the less free the rest of the world is, the more in hoc they are to the CCP because of Belt and Road Initiative, which I think most of the countries in this world are, the more the world will dance to China's tune. I mean, they're rising at the UN, as I explained last time. And let's look at the country of what happens in China, persecution of religious minorities, no freedom whatsoever of expression of anything. An authoritarian regime that controls everything that you do, a racist society. I mean, Americans who go that America's racist, yes, there's race in there. Should go live in China for a bit and see exactly what happens to people who are not white, who are not Asian. The racism is awful, and that's going to be exported to the West as well. Mark my words of that. Anything that comes from the CCP is just very negative and dangerous.
Okay. So what would you say if there were some studies to come out which showed that, let's say, your average Chinese person was much happier than your average Westerner? Would that make you change your mind in any way about the CCP?
No. I'd rather be miserable and live in freedom than live in a gilded cage. I know what it's like to live in a regime that is authoritarian and a police state. Trust me, nothing in the world is worth it, not even your happiness.
Interesting. So you'd rather be miserable and free than happy in a gilded cage?
Absolutely.
Why do you think that is?
Because I know what it's like to live in a gilded cage. I know what it's like to live a life where you are in a police state. And if you object, you're thrown into prison. And to have the state dictate everything to you, who you can marry, where you can live, where you can work. It's absolutely a horrific way to live. I'd rather live feeling miserable because the woke ideologies are driving me nuts. But I'd rather they have the freedom to do that than live in a static society where everything's the same and your life is dictated to by unseen figures that only just, what they dream up is what you have to do. Freedom is a very undervalued value. I'm sorry about my bad language, but it's a very undervalued characteristic, a valued ideology in the West because the West is being free. But it's not free anymore. And so maybe people will value freedom a bit more now.
So do you think there is wisdom to be found in being angry to a greater extent than in being happy with things and resigning yourself to life and whatever life brings your way?
I think, like myself, as the kind of person I am, I tend to look at life as I'm not a kind of a glass half full kind of girl. I'm a glass half empty kind of girl. And I think that's, you probably can tell by the topics I write on. I'm not writing on kittens and recipes, so I'd love to.
You could do it very well.
Thank you. I look at the darker side of life. It's what draws me. And I know that I would rather want the reality of life than live in some kind of unreal existence and not be the real human being that I am, my authentic self. You cannot be your authentic human self when you're living in a police state. There's no way. You cannot live an actualized, healthy human existence when you're under an authoritarian regime, even if you love it. There's no way. It's a false way of living. There's just no way.
So you think if you're a person who lives in China and you're happy, you're deluded?
I would say not deluded. I would say it's, there's some people who love living under authoritarian regimes because they don't have to have any responsibility for things. There are people who think it's fantastic. I would say that but those are in the minority. I say people who are living in China. I say with any despotic regime, as in any authoritarian regime, you will get the minority, the elite, who will love it, of course, and then you'll get another minority who will just think, oh, it's great to have the state take all the responsibility for my life. But humans are we're not carbon copies of each other. We have our own wishes and desires and ways of being. We have a soul. And so we're not going to be, all of us, content living, having to be told to live our life in one way only. And those who are content because of that, those ones are lying to themselves. And that is sad. They've been brainwashed.
So you think freedom is like a necessary condition of leading a meaningful life that's not in some way dishonest with itself?
Freedom is so essential to life. And I know it more because I grew up in an unfree country. Mm-hmm. You cannot live a meaningful life if you are not free. I'd rather, even with anti-Semitism, this is why I, for something like Holocaust denial, and I'll know what I say is probably going to be quite controversial, but I don't believe it should be outlawed. I'd rather know that somebody hates me and is a Holocaust denier than have them smile sweetly to my face without revealing who and what they really are. I'd rather know. I'd rather face the reality head on.
Mm-hmm. So in a way, and rather than ban Holocaust denial, you'd rather win the argument.
Yes, but that's what I've always done with my pieces of anti-Semitism. I've never advocated for anybody who's anti-Semitic to be banned from our TV screens or to be banned from this or banned from that. I've always tried to say, this is anti-Semitic. This is why it's anti-Semitic. This is why anti-Semitism is wrong. Maybe what I've written will now persuade you to kind of, start thinking another way, And I saw that when in 2019, where the majority of Britons didn't let us Jews down and didn't vote for anti-Semitic Labour. That was, God, I didn't know then what we were going to have with the Johnson. They've just turned into monsters. But the point that I'm trying to make is that, it's maybe the approach to hatred is not to ban those who are, saying hateful things and, ban them from life, counteract them, tell them why, let them come to the surface, because if they can't come, if they two things, if they're not allowed to express what they want to say, and I'm not talking about expressing violence, I'm just saying, their stuff, then if they can't express it, one, they'll become even more extreme and more polarized and more dangerous to us. And two, how do you actually change their minds if you censor them so much that they cannot speak? Mm-hmm. And three, I would rather know. I don't want to live in a delusion.
Well, I suppose living in reality is a precondition of dying well. And that brings us to our final piece that we'll be discussing, which is not a piece that you wrote for The Conservative Woman. This is a piece that you wrote for my social media platform, Culture on the Offensive, on death and grief from, I believe it was 2019. This piece on death and grief that was written for Culture on the Offensive, which is what we were in 2019. We were a magazine which became a social media platform, a publishing platform, which is what we are now, Kodo Publishing. But at the time you wrote this for us, we were a magazine. And we were doing long-form essays with pictures and video clips and all sorts of strange things like that. This particular essay you wrote for us was very different to anything else I'd ever seen you write, including the other pieces you did write for Culture on the Offensive.
Yeah.
And that it was the only piece I'd ever seen by you about something excruciatingly personal.
Yeah.
So tell us, what made you decide to write something so personal like this for Culture on the Offensive?
I think mainly because it was a very cathartic thing for me to do, a very healing thing for me to do. I'm quite a private person in a way, so that's why I very rarely write anything personal. But what I went through and the losses that I had, it was so painful. I couldn't speak to anybody about it. If somebody just asked me a question about it, I would literally start to cry hysterically. And so it was too painful for me even to talk about. But I knew I had to release it somehow. And gave me the opportunity to do that, and it was very cathartic for me to write that. And I guess I don't know, you know, I suppose as a writer you kind of want to almost say to people, I'm not just this, I'm also this. You know. And I think I wanted to say, like, you know, I'm not just kind of like writing about politics and this and that. I know what it's like to suffer. I know what it's like to go through some of the worst things a human can experience, the pain, the emotional pain. And I wanted to also kind of say to others, you know, I understand as well. I have empathy if you go through something like this, because I've been through that. So those, I guess, were the reasons.
Mm-hmm. So tell us a bit about the two deaths that this piece explores and explains, and how they affected your life.
My father and sister.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened with them? Okay.
Yeah.
So in 2013, my baby sister, she's 2 years younger than me, was diagnosed with cancer. And I hadn't seen her for a very long time. And she'd been in South Africa, had got divorced, and had come to live with my parents, and I hadn't seen them for a while. And a year later, my father was diagnosed with cancer. And so what happened is then I went to go see my family, and what greeted me reverberates through me that I will never, ever forget it. Basically, my sister had been sick for about, you know, for a long time, not a long time, but enough. And the last time I'd seen her, when she'd come to visit my parents a few years before, my sister was so beautiful. She was incredibly beautiful. She was tall and slender. She had the most exquisite olive skin, these amazing blue eyes, this perfect features. She was like head-turningly beautiful, you know. And I hadn't seen her for, you know, a few years. And I walked into my parents' house, and like there were oxygen bottles everywhere. And my father was sitting in the lounge with an oxygen mask on his face, and he told me and my husband to just prepare ourselves to see my sister. And we went upstairs to the bedroom. My sister was lying, and I have never seen a person so transformed by illness. Like, it was horrific, absolutely horrific. And I think I described it a bit in the piece. And yeah, it was, I will never forget that. It was horrific. And then basically, you know, I spent as much time as I could after that with my family. William was working in Malaysia. I was still studying there, and I was doing my postgraduate diploma in journalism, where we were living as well. And basically, that was the September of 2014. Around about the beginning of October, my sister was moved to hospice, and my father was moved to the hospice as well. And so I spent time, the last visit I made there, it was horrendous, because my sister was in one room, my father was in another, and my sister was dying, my father was dying. And I'd walk between the two rooms that I did for days on end, where, you know, I'd sit with my sister, and then I'd walk to my father's room. And every time I did the walk, as I describe it in the piece, I felt my soul wither and die. It was just, I could not believe that my sister and father were dying at the same time in the same hospice of the same, you know, of cancer. Anyway, that last time that I was there, William came with me. He was back home and from Malaysia, and it was the last time I saw my sister alive. We went back. It was the Sunday, and I remember as well, like I mentioned in the piece as well, my friend Medlin, who I've written about Medlin, Lewis Spencer. I've written about her for Conservative Women as well. Amazing human being who had died of cancer as well. She had been going through a tough time with cancer, and I'd actually spent many times with her when she was having chemo. I'd go and sit with her for hours and end in hospital because she was one of my people that I just absolutely adored and loved, and it was awful to see her suffering. But I really thought she was going to make it. And as we came home and I switched on my computer, I saw a message from my husband that she'd passed literally the night before. So that was horrendous, just that horrendous. And then 4 days later, my mother phoned to tell me that my sister had died. And all I can remember was just screaming on the phone, saying to her, she's not dead, she's sleeping, wake her up. I just couldn't believe, Medland and then my sister, and it was just, and Will had left for Malaysia at that stage, and I told him, don't come back, I'll be okay. So I made my way up north to where my parents were living on my own. And I think that was the hardest part, to be on my own. It was just horrendous. The day of my sister's funeral was the worst day of my entire life. Jews sit shiva, and I've described the funeral in the piece, but to watch my dying father sit shiva for my dead sister was the most horrific thing I've ever experienced. Knowing that he was dying, mourning my sister, it goes against the natural things of life. Anyway, I was there for a number of days, and then I kissed my father goodbye, knowing that that would be the last time I would see him. When I got back, a week later, I had to go to Medland's funeral. And as I said in the piece, even then, I could not really let myself fall apart because it was just too much. But the stress of it, everything of it, the pain of it really got me and exacerbated my ME symptoms. And then 3 weeks to the day that my sister died, my father died. And then my mother called me again to tell. By that stage, my father had been moved up the hospice back home, and I spoke to him about 2 days before he died, and told him how much I loved him. And then, 2 days later, my mother called to tell me my father had died. And it was exactly 21 days between my sister's death and my father's death. And I was too sick to go to the funeral. And so I did, and Will was still in Malaysia. I told him not to come back. So I did an amazing ritual with my amazing cousin, who's an artist and lives in Bristol. We did a ritual over the phone together, which was incredible. And that really helped. And that is what happened. And then, as I mentioned in the piece, one of my best friends died of ovarian cancer 9 months later. And she was my rock. She was the only person I called the day of my sister's funeral. And so her loss was just, it was horrific. So that was not a good year. It was a horrible year.
Yeah. I suppose one of the things that comes across hearing all of that and reading about it is how lucky you are.
How what, sorry?
How lucky you are.
In what sense?
Well, you're here.
Yes.
And even though you had all of that trauma and all of that loss in such a dense period of time that most people don't ever experience. I mean, we all have losses like that, but they tend to happen over time. Like, once you have one death like that per decade normally.
Yes, exactly.
You don't have them all in 1 year.
No. And you don't have your father and sister die 21 days from each other either. Very rare.
So how do you feel about the fact that even though all of this horrible death came to your family, you were spared and you're still here?
It's interesting because I've had a lot of things that have been very difficult for me in my life. And I think one of the things, as I mentioned in the piece, what it does, particularly the deaths that I experienced and the way I experienced it, is that it taught me to prioritize and to really look for what is important in life and to find joy wherever I can. Now, I do struggle finding joy because I'm not the most kind of positive of people, but I do try and find joy in everything that I can. And most importantly, it's taught me how precious life is. And I know that's a cliche, but it is. Life is so precious. This is why I'm so horrified by what's everything going on, because life is not just about living and dying. Life is about meaning and joy and happiness and freedom. And I think what I went through, it just, instead of getting stuck in crap and the minutiae of life and the nonsense of life and whatever, to really look for the truth in life. Because I suppose what it did to me, yes, I felt it darkened my soul a bit. Of course it would. But in a way, it brightened my soul, because I thought, my God, I survived that. I actually came out of there thinking, parts of me, when I went through that, I thought I was actually going to lose my mind from grief and from the suffering of my family. But I came out of it in a way stronger, and I came out of it with a new perspective on life, with this kind of almost a religious fervor to make sure I do not waste a single second of my life at all on this planet, and that everything I do needs to be done to alleviate suffering of others, and every single way that I can. That's what came out of it for me.
Mm-hmm. So, in having this sort of larger perspective on what you want your life to be, when you do pass, how do you want to be remembered?
I don't know. I kind of never thought of that. Do you know, I just want to be remembered that I did something good for this world. Having done something good for this world would be something that I would like.
Mm-hmm.
That's, I guess, how I would want to be remembered. I did some good somewhere.
And it's interesting how that's very non-specific.
Yeah. Yeah, because I never know where life is going to take me.
Like
so.
Because what I would have said is, well, I have 3 books I want to finish. I have a bunch of films I want to make. I've got a bunch of podcasts I want to do. I think of it more in terms of achievements. I don't think of it in terms of just, well, people thought I was nice.
I suppose in terms of achievements, because I've had so many knockbacks in my life, I suppose I kind of think, okay, I don't know where writing's going to take me. I'll put all my time and effort into it for many, many reasons, but who knows? It could completely go off and disappear from my life in a few years' time. So, it's more about what did I do during my time in this world? What good did I actually do, whether it's through writings or what kind of person I am or whatever it is? That to me sort of is more comfortable for me to think of, because I'm so always slightly scared that what I achieve in life will be taken away from me. So I guess I don't really focus on it that much.
Do you have a vision of what it would mean for you to live an unsuccessful life, a life that you would not be happy with when it's over? What to you is unsuccessful as living?
You know what it's like? I think in many ways in my life, I feel I've been very unsuccessful in many things and very successful in others. So I think for me, I know it's going to sound like a cliche or whatever, but love has always been a very important thing to me. And I think if I'd lived this life not being loved and not being able to love and not being married and not experiencing that, then I would have felt that I had an unsuccessful life. I'm a very emotional person. And I feel things on a very deep, sensitive level. And so love is very, very important to me on many, many levels. And I think an unsuccessful life for me would have been to have been unloved and not being able to be married. And I'm, not married, but I'm talking about finding the right person for me in this life as I did and not being able to spend that time with him. That to me would have been unsuccessful. So I suppose I'm so, I am reluctant to put success in terms of career, because I've had times when I thought I was going to be successful with something and then I wasn't. So I'm always slightly scared to think, oh, I'm successful now, because I'm so scared I'm going to fall flat on my face again, God forbid. So I guess I concentrate more on the emotions of life when it comes to the ideas of success.
So why is love so important to you? What is it about love that you value so much?
I think with love, it's what gives me particularly meaning and joy in life. And, when I was younger, I was always falling in and out of love in relationships, and the thrill of it and the fun of it, and even the heartbreak of it would be, very kind of, it makes me feel alive. And not just love, like, in a relationship, but like, love with friends. I'm very lucky. I have very, very good friends who I love and hopefully love me, and love for humanity. And love to me is, it just feels like the most positive way to live your life, to love others and have others love you, because it gives me particularly, that's what gives me the most joy and meaning in life. And that's, it gives me meaning, gives me joy. And it's about, how do you define love? I mean, there's so many different ways of loving another human being, and you can love others that you've never met. But I often have deep feelings for people, for friends, and for people, some people that I have never met on social media, like, who I've never even spoken to. I love, because they come across as such beautiful souls, such amazing humans, and I think, wow, I really love this person. They're incredible. It's like looking at what makes a human the most incredible, wonderful person. And I love seeing that in people. I love seeing the good parts of people, because I see so much of the negative in what I write, that the love allows me to see the good.
Mm-hmm. So do you feel like you are loved enough, or do you wish you had more
Oh,
love?
I've had so much love in my life. I've been so lucky. And I know I drive my poor hubby a little bit crazy. It takes a lot of patience to be married to me, but I know he loves me beyond anything. And that love is amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm very lucky to experience it.
Yeah. Well, so you've had these two very extreme things in your life. You've had death in quick succession of people you love, but you also have had a lot of love from both those people who have passed on and people who are still here.
Yes.
Um, One of the things you talked about in the piece is grief, and you
Yes.
wrote, quote, "Death is a certainty. It happens to all of us, but in Western society we seem to have banished it from not only our minds, but from our cultures too. The dead are hardly even mentioned. Grieving becomes a very private affair behind closed doors, and the dead, who were once living their own lives, are hardly ever mentioned again, except by those who mourn them the hardest. But those who grieve are desperate to talk. Not only do they want to keep the memories alive of those they have lost, but they need to vent their own pain," unquote. Now, this is a very interesting passage you've written, because it's on the one hand understandable that you would write it given all the horrific death that you've experienced and needing to vent your pain. But I was curious, do you think for other people it's easier to be not so focused on death unless it's immediately impacting them?
I think it's not so much easier, but it's more how we're primed to be as human beings. We're not supposed to think about death that often. We're supposed to get on with surviving in this world. I
Mm-hmm.
think one of the problems is that there's a slight imbalance in that in the Western world. Like, for example, in South Africa, like, there's certain cultures that death is, I guess what I'm trying to say is, in the West, death has become sanitized in a way. There's not that many, thank God, children dying of starvation and childhood diseases. A lot of people live to a very old age. I think in Zimbabwe or in a lot of African countries, by the time you're 50, you'll probably die by then. Lack of good nutrition, diseases, no health services, etc. Whereas in the West, people live long lives, reasonably healthy lives. Death has become sanitized. It doesn't happen as often as it does in places like the developing world. And so it's not an everyday experience for most people. So it is shut aside. So you have two things. One, the very human primal instinct of not to think about death, but to think about surviving and living. It's our ego that keeps us alive. And two, the way that death is sanitized and not as apparent in the West as it is in other countries and other parts of the world. And so, and I would say, coming back to what's happening with regard to the response to COVID, people are terrified of dying. They do not see it as a natural part of our lives. You can't ward off death to the point that you destroy everything else around you. That's the thing that I spoke about last time. So death has got a very odd sort of status in the West, mainly because we've been very successful at warding it off, at keeping people's lives, people living longer, people, less children dying from childhood diseases compared to what happens in Africa, etc. So, it's not in our face all the time, as it would be if you lived in a place like Zimbabwe.
So, do you think in a way the West, by warding off death so successfully, we've made people too frightened of death, and because we're too frightened of death, we don't approach it in a healthy way?
Absolutely. I think death, nobody likes to speak about it because of the reasons, it's uncomfortable and you can be seen as morbid, or it goes against our very own survival mechanism. But it's become, people don't, because they don't live with it as much as, like, even in the West 50 years ago, people would have been a lot more comfortable with death because it would be happening more often. And it's not a good thing that it happened more often. I'm just saying that would have been people's reality. But now people have a skewed idea of death. They think that it's something that has to be avoided at all costs. But you can't avoid death at all costs because, either life is risk. You risk you stand up and you walk out the front door and you risk. So it's about, kind of mitigating and balancing what is actually more important. And the one thing that is certain, we will all die. It's how we die and when we die. And how we live our lives between being born and dying, that is most important. I don't want to live a life where everything is shut down and I'm locked down and the government's dictating my every move. That's not a life to live. Or because I'm told that will stop me dying. The West has a very skewed idea of death, and it's getting worse.
One of the things that you've written in this piece is, quote, Westerners have adopted identity politics as their religion now. Judeo-Christian spirituality is now seen as passé, too restrictive and not applicable to 21st century life. This is intergenerational, with more people rejecting the traditional notion of a biblical God and seeking to anchor themselves either in New Age spirituality, a far more fluid notion of God, or none at all. But not believing in a power greater than ourselves is to inflate our own sense of importance, this same narcissism that drives identity politics and is destructive for society, unquote. Now that's a fascinating passage, because it reminds me of, ironically, the same criticism that comes to religion from secular people, which is belief in God is also narcissistic because it presumes your life has some sort of special cosmic importance. So both sides are accusing the other of being narcissistic. How do we resolve this paradox?
Why shouldn't you think that your life is special? Why shouldn't you think that you're born to do great things? I don't want to live a life where I think, oh my God, my life is mundane and terrible. And, it's good if people think that they are special. I think it's important for them to do that. And you counteract that by believing something better and bigger than yourself, i.e. God. I think it's, a belief in God doesn't also necessarily translate to thinking that you're just special and wonderful because you believe in God. I mean, I believe very deeply in God, and trust me, I don't think I'm special and wonderful in any way. In fact, I have a very, my relationship with God is quite difficult. I'm often very angry at God. And I don't feel special at all because of things that have happened in my life. So I don't think it necessarily translates. Yes, some people might think, oh, I believe in God, so I'm special. But I think that's very few. I think a belief in God doesn't necessarily lead you to be narcissistic. But what does lead you to be narcissistic is to actually believe in yourself and totally, to the point that you think that you're so marvelous and so great, and everything that you think counts, and what other people think doesn't count, which is what we're seeing with woke ideology. Oh my goodness, somebody called me this horrible name, so let's all censor that person, and who cares what they think? They're terrible because they called me a terrible name. There's a narcissistic nasal gazing that keeps coming. Whereas with looking in terms of like a belief in God, a belief in something greater than yourselves, you don't wish to harm others, even if they have harmed you. There's no, I think it teaches you to be a bit more empathetic, because you are believing in a higher power than yourself. You're believing in something greater than yourself, and that you're taking the perspective out of just who you are as a human into another dimension, into another perspective, other than just being you on this planet.
What would you say to somebody who says it's better to not believe in God to develop empathy, because if you believe in God, everything becomes contextualized in the question of whether or not God will punish me or not punish me, rather than does someone else's life and suffering have value independently of what's going to happen to me?
I think it depends on your perception of God. I think if you see God as this all-punishing, all-judging being, then that is how you're going to perceive the rest of the world and perceive what people do. But if you see God as a being of light and love, the way that I see God, and that I see my own religion, Judaism, as a moral code for me, and it informs a lot of my own perception on life and what it is, then that can only, to me, be something that's positive.
Okay. So one of the things you've written in this piece relating to God and grief is, quote, "In the hollowness of grief, questions which previously floated in the peripheries of our minds come roaring out. Is there life after death? Does God exist? And if so, why is there so much suffering? What is the meaning of life? Some might even have visions of their loved ones in an afterlife. Grief can feel insurmountable to the extent that mourners might want to commit suicide in an attempt to join the loved ones who have passed. Only by granting a mourner space to talk can we know if that person is having suicidal thoughts, which occur more frequently than you might think. This is one of the many reasons why giving a mourner space to talk about their dead, for as long as they need it, is crucial," unquote. Now, this is interesting. This is really fascinating because you're making a connection here between mourning and feeling suicidal. Mm-hmm. When you experienced the string of deaths in your life that you did you feel suicidal?
I don't remember feeling suicidal, but I do know that during the time I just try to move from one day to the next. I didn't feel suicidal because I missed them, which, I didn't want to join them, but I know there are people whose loved ones die and they want to join them. But what made me feel sometimes that, and I wouldn't call it I felt suicidal, but I just felt that life was too painful to live because of the memory of their suffering. And that, it didn't make me feel suicidal, it didn't make me want to end my life, but it made me feel that life was becoming impossible for me to live because it was so incredibly painful to live. Mm-hmm. So I would say that for myself personally, no, I didn't experience that. But I would say that there are people who cannot live without their loved ones and want to join them, mm-hmm. by committing suicide.
Do you think that's negative?
I think it's sad and negative, very much so. I mean, nothing, I'd never say, oh, it's bad and, oh, it's don't do it or whatever. It just shows you how grief can really destroy a human being. It's probably the grief and grieving process is the toughest thing I've ever experienced. Mm-hmm. And it's soul destroying. Mm-hmm. And it gets too much for some people, and it's sad.
Do you think that's because you associate being able to cope with life with having somebody there? And when that person isn't there, it feels like, shit, how do I cope?
I think very much so. I think that is an element of it, God forbid, a million times something should happen to Will. God forbid. I don't know how to cope. On many levels, I don't know how. Whether that would lead me to, God forbid, committing suicide, I can't say. I wouldn't want to, and I don't think I would. Having survived this, I think I can survive most things now. But I think some people, they do. Grief does that. And also, when you are grieving, when you go through grief like that, you're often not thinking rationally. I mean, I can't believe, like, on both nights, the days that my father and sister died, I tried to go to my journalism class. I can't believe I even tried to do that. I wasn't thinking rationally. I wasn't, I was just in so much pain. And I just remember thinking, I've got to try to do everything normal and every day, just so that, I've just got to keep some sense of normality. I mean, going to the journalism class was hilarious, because after half an hour, I actually thought the teacher was talking in another language. I could barely think. I couldn't even understand what she was saying. I was so grief-stricken, and I was literally in shock. And so, these are, when you're that deeply in grief and in shock, you don't think rationally either.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think is the key to getting through that grief and getting back to some semblance of normalcy? How long does it take, for instance, to get rid of it?
I'm still waiting. I would say, don't do what I did. Don't swallow your grief down. Don't, because people won't really want to talk to you about it. Nobody's ever, none of my friends and people that I know talk to me about it. No, hardly anyone mentions it to me. Because, I think a lot of people find it very difficult to mention. What do you say? And even very early on afterwards, nobody really said anything about it. I know that if I wanted to talk, my friends that have been there for me. But I'd have to ask them for that. People don't want to talk about things like that. And I would say that, don't do what I did. Don't swallow the grief down. Don't hide from the world because of it. Talk to your loved ones. Talk to your friends about it. Express it. Say, I want to talk about it. I want to talk about how I'm feeling. Even if it's excruciatingly painful and you cry buckets, do it. Talk about it. The one thing that I did do when I was in Canada, because the grief just was overwhelming, even literally 3 years afterwards, because of the suffering they went through, the grief and pain I felt was just overwhelming, as I sought out a therapist, and I had grief counseling for 18 months. And I would say to anybody, even if they, please God, never have to go through what I went through, but even if they just lose one person and the grief is overwhelming, seek out professional help. I did that. And actually, it was my therapist's idea. He kept saying to me, write on this, Karen. You're a writer, right? And I couldn't bring myself to do it until I met you and you gave me that space. And I would say to people, get professional help with grief, because it is far harder and far more soul destroying and far more devastating to you than you think it's going to be.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It is very difficult to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
I was happy to give you the platform to write what you wrote.
Thanks, Greg.
Not just because I thought it was good for you, but also because I thought it would be really interesting to write something about this topic rather than just another article about why woke sucks. And unfortunately, we have to talk about why woke sucks, because we live in an age where if we don't, soon we won't be able to. So that's why, unfortunately, a lot of this culture war stuff that we're embroiled in can sort of, from an outsider's perspective, sound a bit monotonous, but it's because if we don't talk about this stuff, we won't be able to soon. And we'll live in a society much more like China.
Yes, exactly.
But I also think it's important to talk about other things apart from just the fact that we don't like what's going on in terms of the change of our social norms and laws. And one thing that's really important to talk about is that we're all human, and we have human experiences that have a universal quality and relatability to them, even if you think everything we've said about politics is complete bullshit.
Yes, absolutely. And that comes back to what I was saying about China and the authoritarian rule and this whole homogenous society. Everyone's different. We all have our own individual experiences of life, and how we feel things and how we experience things and how we think of things as well is very different from each other. You might have similar, but we each have our own individual way of experiencing life. And so, you can't just say to me, we've got to be just this one way, you've got to do it just like this. I've seen those kind of social engineering projects, like in apartheid South Africa, like in authoritarian China, like in North Korea, like in Iran, and any fundamental Islamist country. People suffer because they cannot be themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of virtue on living an authentic life. And it's a gift. It's a privilege to live an authentic life. I'm talking, for example, like the persecuted Christians that we're talking about. They can't live an authentic life. They can't be the Christians they want to be. They can't do anything except about thinking about survival. Living an authentic, fulfilled, meaningful, joyful life is a privilege. It means that everything else that you have to worry about, you don't have to worry about anymore. You're surviving. You're not being persecuted. You've got food. You've got shelter. So now you can look at the loftier things of life. We're so lucky to be able to do that.
Yeah, but the problem is a lot of people today think the authentic life is to be able to wear a dress and lipstick and call your penis female and force other people to do the same. And they feel like if they can't force other people to do that, they're like a persecuted Christian that you've described.
And that comes back to the narcissistic navel gazing of the West, where where people have no sense of perspective of what real suffering is. And I blame the left for that, because the left dominates the discussion on this. And persecuted Christians and everything else that we've spoken about just is nowhere to be seen. People think they've been persecuted if somebody says, "Oh, well, I don't really think wearing a dress and lipstick makes you a woman if you're a man." That's not persecution. Persecution is you quietly murmur a prayer to God or to Jesus, and your neighbor shops you, and off you go to the concentration camp in North Korea. That's persecution.
Why do you think our notion of persecution in the West has gotten so petty in the last even 10 years? Why are such small things now considered acts of grievous harm?
Because we've solved everything else in the West. We have equality for race, religion, sexism's for sex. We've progressed. So that the West is it was until a year ago, a very enlightened place to live. So I wrote about this several years ago for Conservative Women about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and how, like Maslow, thought that we would reach a utopia where everything would be wonderful once you've gone through all the whole things of, the very basic human needs of shelter, and then you go into the intellectualism, et cetera, and then coming to, once society grows to the point that everything is taken care of, you don't have millions starving, and you're a functional, progressive, enlightened society, that you become a utopia. But what has happened is it's sort of gone onto another pathway. Instead of actualizing the way Maslow thought we would into this wonderful utopia, because people have got nothing really to worry about, they start worrying about things they start making problems where there doesn't have to be any. And I think that's very much human nature. If we weren't worried about having enough food to eat and fleeing the latest Islamist attack on our village, or, being thrown into the gulag because we're Jew in Russia, if we weren't worried about that, then we can worry about other things. Then we can start to kind of think, well, oh, well, that person says a horrible word to me, or that person doesn't believe in this, so let's persecute them. Let's call them, racist bigots, etc., because they're persecuting me. So I guess what I'm saying is, I think it's human nature. And no matter where humanity is, no matter what a human has, they will always find something to worry about and to pick apart. Unfortunately, we're seeing this on a mass scale in the West. And the mass scale in the West is not about picking apart major, terrible things. It's about, it's a microaggression because that person winked at me. The West has gone down a very horrible path, and I don't like it. Does that make sense, what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose one of the things that I always ask myself, I don't know the answer to this question, is, are human beings naturally fucked up in the sense that if you give them the best social conditions, even then they'll fuck those social conditions up? So it's better to give them not too many good things Because if you give them too many good things, they become like spoiled children and they ruin it all.
I think humans can be very destructive, but I still think, we should strive to be the best we can, and we should strive to make the place that we live, the country that we live in, the best and most enlightened and free and happiest place to live, truly happy and truly meaningful. What's happening now in this country is the opposite way around. Yes, it will be wrecked in some way because humans have this kind of destructive tendency to wreck or to find problems where there are none. I think it's just part of being human. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try and have good things and have, we can counteract it. I mean, this is why I'm very big about love, because love, when you love someone, even someone you don't know, when you truly love your fellow human being, you don't want to destroy things for them. You might want to destroy things for yourself in some way or another. We can be quite self-destructive. But if you really, really love your fellow human being, if you really love them, you don't want to do anything to destroy or harm them.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that note, I think our podcast is finished and we've discussed everything that is related to the 4 pieces that we said we were going to discuss beginning of yesterday.
Thanks, Greg. Thank you very much for having me on, and I hope I answered all your questions properly and didn't go on too much on a tangent. And
no, we have 2 episodes. We'll probably do them once a week, part 1 and part 2. And you're a very good guest to have. So thank you for coming.
Oh, thank you so much, Greg. Thank you so much for asking me to do this. I've never really had the opportunity to discuss my writing like this, so I'm really grateful for the opportunity to do so, and thank you so much.
Yeah, I've heard you on podcasts before, but nothing like this.
No, I've never done anything like this, and I have to say, I really enjoyed it, and I like the challenge of it, because often I write something and then I move on to the next, and I know what happens to me during the writing process, but to go back and look at it and to see why I wrote it and further ideas developing from it has been a wonderful experience and a very good introspective experience for me. So thank you.
Well, no, thank you. I mean, the writing is interesting, so I thought that's why it would be good to talk about it and get to the thinking behind the thinking, which is one of the things that we're interested in Culture on the Offensive. That was the Culture on the Offensive podcast. This is Greg Scorzo. If you like this podcast and other material that we do at Coda Publishing, check us out at www.cultureontheoffensive.com. And if you're interested in the radio play that we just finished, Love Before COVID, based on my book, Post-Socratic Dialogues Love, there will be a link below, so stay safe, be courageous, and don't forget to go outside of your comfort zone. And remember, when you hear things that sound wrong or stupid or silly or strange, don't forget to use empathy, clarity, and courage.